Now this here is my new Intel processor that I grabbed from CEX for a measly 1p. And for those of you wondering, yes, you can click and collect at CEX now, which means that as long as you pick it up yourself, you don't pay delivery. And walking is free. Now this tends to happen when they stop accepting an item in for trade-in, and they simply aren't shifting them anymore. Because let's be honest, who out there is going to CEX to buy an old 775 processor in the first place? Not all too many people. But when you spend this little on a processor, does it actually work? Fortunately, we did get a rather decent LGA 775 system a few weeks ago in the form of a cheap Novatech gaming PC. So we are giving this thing the most optimal chance it could have with modern features like DDR3. We have SATA ports as well. It's about as modern as it gets for LGA 775. But still, it's time to find out what happens when we boot up a PC using the 1P processor. Right, so what we're going to do is take off this horrible stock cooler. We're going to remove this Core 2 quad, and we're going to put in the Celeron 450 1P processor. We'll give it this cooler. Now, does it work? Well, there we go. Celeron 450 at 2.2 gigahertz. It works. Let's give this thing an operating system and find out just how well a 1P processor does. Because I'm not thinking all too well. Not at all. With that all out of the way though, and our operating system installing, why don't we find out a little bit about what processor we actually managed to get our hands on. Released in late 2008, this here is probably one of the weakest Core 2 Duo era chips. No, it isn't a Celeron D or anything like that. It is one of the few, slightly odd and slightly rare, single-core versions of the Core 2 Duo chip, and it was released as a cut-down Celeron. It's not a Core Solo chip, which came before this. Nope, it is a full Core 2 Duo-style architecture chip, just with one core, which is very strange. But likely the reason that no one is buying them is that it's one core. On something that's entire selling point was that it was the Core 2 Duo. It does boast a very cheap launch price and low power consumption, and these flooded the market. The only reason they're slightly rare now is because most people have put them in the bin. So, you know, not exactly a surprise. The only real novelty is the fact that it's odd, and you can pick them up for pennies, and that makes it the cheapest processor on the market today, a title it held in 2008, and now once again here in 2024. Right, so you join me here at the launch screen of Windows with the Intel Celeron 450, which is the 1P processor. And we're currently at Windows 10, a stripped down version that we've used before, running on a decent LGA 775 system with a Matrox graphics card implemented, and it's just settled down. I've probably already explained that it took a long time to get to this point, but we're currently sat at the desktop and we're idling with around 6 to 7% usage. It did take around 45 minutes to get to this point, with the CPU pegged at 100% utilization, right up until the moment they decided, nope, I've sorted out everything I want to, it's now going to sort of work. If we move anything around the desktop screen, the CPU usage does actually spike up to 100%, and will stay that way until we stop shaking things around the desktop, which is interesting. But all that's really left to do is give this thing a test in its stock environment, and then we're going to see how far we can really push this. But, you know, it's a 1P processor. We want to find out how does it perform if you just went out, bought this thing, stuck it in a computer, and started using it. And, I don't have high hopes. Performance as it stood was rough. Loading a web browser was an experience similar to that of a Pentium 4, just without the heat. and after waiting and waiting, we were able to download CPU-Z, just to confirm the specifications of the processor you've just seen. And doing basic tasks like this was just about manageable. It wasn't fun to do, and you'd have an easier time pulling out your phone in 2024 than actually using this PC with a 1P processor, but you could do most things you needed to do. And it was able to manage some modern web browsing, or at least, get through setting things up on the operating system. It's also worth mentioning that we are running a Matrox C680 graphics card, as it has virtually no driver overheads, meaning everything we're seeing here is the processor grasping its way through the modern world of Windows 10. But this is where things went from okay-ish to near enough terrible fairly quickly. And yes, I was perhaps being a little bit harsh by running Windows 10, but when I saw it wasn't a Celeron D, well, we had an Intel Core Celeron, so I had relatively high hopes, especially given that we'd been looking at the Core 2 Quad recently, and that was holding up remarkably well. It was just I went to launch Steam, and that's where the waiting began. It took no word of a lie. 40 minutes to download and install the latest Steam update. Most of it wasn't the download, most of it was extracting files, and I kept hoping that maybe it crashed and just needed to be rebooted to get it, up and running again. But no, it was there, just running really slowly, struggling to get its way through the latest Steam update. And eventually we did get it installed and Steam was running. It wasn't fast, but it was for all intents and purposes running Steam. So, to give us a baseline of what kind of performance we could expect, I launched GTA 5, which proved to be a major mistake. After nearly 56 minutes of loading. That's right, near enough an hour was spent trying to see just what kind of performance we could get in a title that I consider to be pretty well optimised. I mean, we've ran it on Celerons before, so it's not that unrealistic to try it now. And all I can say is that after all that waiting, don't for 2 seconds believe the numbers that it's saying it's getting in frames per second down the bottom. It ran like a slideshow, and I've also edited out the segments of waiting between scenes, as these could take anywhere from 5 through to 15 minutes to load. Performance didn't seem great, but at least from this we knew that it supported modern applications, meaning maybe there were some things we could do to improve the performance. And so it began. With little in the way of performance being achieved, there was one thing we could do. This thing is worthless, so we can boost the clocks as high as it could possibly go, and I spent the next 30 minutes trying to find the most stable overclock that would offer us some decent performance. Overall, we managed to reach up to the dizzying heights of 3.5 GHz on this little Celeron, which is actually quite an increase. That's going from 2.2 to 3.5 GHz here. Pushing it any more than this required so much voltage that it wasn't the chip I was worried about. I can go out and buy another one of these for 1p. It was that the board would probably fry at the voltages we needed to hit anything over sort of 3.6 GHz. So anyway, I took that as it was, ran it at 3.5. But still, we saw pretty much double the performance when testing in a quick benchmark. So things should be twice as good, right? Well, no. In terms of actual usage on Windows, maybe it was a little bit faster, but this could have all been placebo. At this point, I was probably about 2 days into using this chip, and it was still painfully slow. I just think I'd sort of become accustomed to how slow it was at this point. This is the performance of Intel's legendary Celeron. But by this point, I'd wasted this time on this. The chip just couldn't hold up with Windows 10. But with a fresh set of ideas in the morning, maybe there was something we could do about this. I decided to whack Windows 7 on the PC, which used to be my go-to operating system of choice, as probably most of you already know. But with plenty of programs dropping support, it's beginning to find itself somewhere in this weird no-man's land of operating systems. Too new for retro applications, too old for modern software, and too good to go forgotten. Seriously, this is Windows at its peak. If this was still supported, I would still be using Windows 7 all the time. And after a quick install, which genuinely took no time at all, I think within 15 minutes we had it up and running, things were transformed. Yes, this 1P processor was clocked as high as the hills, but everything was working. We were running multitasking just fine with one core, and suddenly things felt snappy. I felt like I'd been ridiculous trying Windows 10 on this for so long, out of the idea that I needed software support, when realistically, we probably should have started with Windows 7. But then again, we don't start these videos, just throw it in at the easy end. We've got to test some of the hard stuff first, and then gradually scale back from there. But there was one big challenge. We needed Steam. And everyone had been telling me all over the internet that it's a complete nightmare to run today on Windows 7, all support had been lost, and there was no point even trying it. So that's one of the reasons why I'd kind of moved away from Windows 7. But after loading up the same install we had on Windows 10, it downloaded an update of some sort, unpacked them all, which was slow, bear in mind, about the same as Windows 10, but it was running. It was slow if you tried to do anything with it, and it did remind us that it would stop working in 0 days, but Steam seems to work absolutely fine on Windows 7 still, which opens up a lot of possibilities for me still. So we had everything we needed here. We had web browsing, we had a way to do some gaming, and we had the whole operating system running. Now we are running the 1P Celeron 450 with 6GB of DDR3 RAM running in dual channel and a Matrox C680 graphics card to make sure we can get the best possible performance out of this thing. All the benchmarks have been captured as I saw them, so now we can live through possibly the strangest gaming performance I have ever seen. No, trust me, these benchmarks are downright weird. So anyway, let's find out just how strange they were in the benchmarks. Starting things off with the original release of Half-Life 2, running here with high settings, and performance was not that great. This is the first benchmark I did, and I thought it was oddly appropriate to use Comic Sans up in the top left, so we do change that later on. Anyway, it was pretty much on par with a mid-life Pentium 4. Generally, you could see well over 60 FPS when things weren't too busy, but as soon as the action started and physics got engaged, the chip could drop down to the high 20s, sometimes even lower than this when explosions were going on. I'd hate to see the performance without the overclock here, as, it is struggling even at 3.5 GHz. But for all intents and purposes, Half-Life 2 was playable on a 1P processor, and that isn't something I ever thought I would say could happen, but here it is. Even if it was a little bit questionable, and this release of the game did come out 4 years before the chip did. But that's not the context we're looking at it in. We are looking at the context that for 1P, you can run this. Skyrim was next, which left me absolutely amazed, because it ran far beyond my expectations with the game being completely playable once the world had loaded in. Sure, if you went around a little bit too quick, it could hitch up a little bit, but that wasn't the end of the world. What was the end of the world was that after a little bit of playing, at random, it didn't matter if you ran the game stock or with an overclock, the processor could just blue screen running Skyrim. I have no idea what's causing this. I checked the system, I checked the drivers, I tried another graphics card. Nope, doesn't matter. This processor just weirds out with Skyrim and decides to blue screen. So quick save often enough, and it is playable, I suppose. Toning things back just a little bit with the Elder Scrolls Oblivion, and it was definitely a more stable experience than that of Skyrim, in the sense that it didn't crash the system, but still there were definitely hitches when the game had to process any form of lighting. When we saw around 38 FPS on average, this could dip down a lot more when those sort of lighting effects were going on, but still, it ran okay. The performance wasn't much better than Skyrim, and that's what I mean here when I say the performance is strange. It's not great performance, it's passable, but so far it doesn't matter what title we've chosen, it sticks to the same sort of frame rate. It doesn't seem to do better or worse than any specific title. It just goes, yep, I can just about manage it, and it carries on. And it's very odd that it does that in games that should run better, and also those that should run worse. To see if this effect carried on more, I toned things back even more with The Elder Scrolls Morrowind, where we saw closer to 50 FPS on average. But even then, this would drop down to the high 30s a lot of the time when it was actually having to do some processing in the towns and cities. And don't go turning up the settings any higher than, sort of medium, because that would tank the frame rate, especially in towns and cities. When you're off out in the middle of nowhere, you could see well over 100 frames, even if combat was going on. So once again, the chip finds a way to run and sticks with it, but generally it wants to go back to that 30 FPS mark whenever things get a little bit intense, because very little you can do here makes it run any differently. I did try this stock as well, and the performance was similar, just with a lower average. So, very strange. Very, very strange. To really hammer the Celeron, I launched RimWorld, which took an unbelievably long time to load. But when it did, the early game was surprisingly playable. Higher speeds would make the game go not all too much faster, but this game mostly just uses one core by itself anyway. And honestly, the speed difference between this and a Core 2 quad, well, there wasn't a huge difference. Maybe some performance mods could help you achieve even higher frame rates, but it'll take you longer to get those installed than it would to just simply put up with it and play the game like I did here. Because if I launch RimWorld, chances are I get carried away with it, and then even on a Celeron here, I'd deem it just about playable. Just that late game is going to be quite rough. Fallout 4 would load up to the menu in around 45 minutes, and then would sit here when you loaded a game, eventually turning into a windowed black box that did nothing. So about standard performance for a new Bethesda game. Fable the Lost Chapters once again proving that this Celeron is just weird and was unplayable with higher settings, even for a game from 2004. So we had to use medium settings to claw back some performance, and it was okay, very similar to that of the original Xbox, which I'm not too sure is a compliment here, because, we have a similar architecture and 4 times the clock speed, but that's besides the point. The original Xbox is not a 1p processor. Still, when lots of NPCs were on screen, the frame rate could drop quite a lot, but still, another classic title that's just about playable on a 1p processor, and I keep having to remind myself, the performance is not great for a chip from 2008, but this isn't a 2008 chip anymore. This is an old processor that you can buy with the change you can find on the floor, and that is what makes it impressive. Not the context of its release, but the context of it today. More impressive was the world of emulation, with Wind Waker running here using the old performance fork of Dolphin, and we did have to tweak around with the settings a bit to get things running a tad smoother. But even then, it didn't take too long to do that. We were able to turn up the internal resolution quite a bit, and things looked great. There wasn't too much slowdown. And even if there was, well, you could easily do some more tweaking with the settings to keep things running smoother. It's another weird turn of events of how well a 1p processor can somehow even manage GameCube emulation. I swear, the performance here makes no sense. Every benchmark is its own weird adventure. It's astonishing. Unfortunately, BeamNG was not the experience you would have wanted to have, with a big old red warning telling you that the game will not run on a single core. Now, I've not seen that one before, and don't click it, because that will actually crash the game. Trust me, I tried. Do not let curiosity get the better of you. That warning stays. The only map that would actually load is the basic grid in the lowest of low settings, and it was actually quite responsive given the frame rate. I did expect worse. Menus could bring the game to a crawl if you were running it, as the transparency effect was near enough impossible for the Celeron to manage, so just accept what the game gives you and go from there. And you too could drive through a world of nothingness at a whopping 7 FPS, with the occasional frame drop. Minecraft did actually run. I was using the old Tekkit Classic mod pack with fast settings enabled, and with a bit of time spent loading, not as much as the other games keep in mind, it wasn't actually too bad, often hovering around the mid-30s, which is perfectly playable, and probably not too far off how I used to play the game with a Core 2 Duo, hampered by a horrible Intel GMA chip. I wouldn't go turning up the render distance, as that would hammer performance, but in a strange turn of events, putting them down from the default settings doesn't improve performance. So I don't know what the 1p CPU wants to do here. Nothing about the benchmark still makes sense. You'd think turning down the render distance in Minecraft would improve your performance, at least processor wise, but no, Minecraft just runs like this, you get about 30 FPS, and I'd consider that pretty playable. Given I still had the install files on hand for Unreal Tournament, I thought I'll give it a go and see how it'll hold up in a classic arena shooter that came out years before this processor existed. And you know what? I'd call this a very competitive experience for a 1P processor. Sure, there might not be hundreds of frames, but it was usually over 60 FPS, and that is the first time I had seen this all day on this processor. Seeing over 60 FPS was not something it likes to do. So, you know, I'll take this game running well, and it was really a thing to behold after every single one of those previous benchmarks. It didn't even take long to load, so Unreal Tournament 2003, absolutely perfect. But can it run Crysis? I mean, it's from the Core 2 Duo era, so surely some of those architectural parts must give it a fighting chance. And well, no. The game struggled to break 20 FPS during our usual benchmark, but could hit playable frames when the action had just subsided. Really, this is what puts it into perspective of where this 1P processor lies. It didn't matter how many clocks we gave it, or the architecture it's based on being relatively decent, if you cut down a processor enough, you end up with performance that simply lags behind. But still, Crysis running, admittedly quite poorly, on something this cheap. That has probably got to be a world first. Overall performance was weird. In some cases, this thing wasn't actually too much worse than a low-clocked stock Core 2 Duo, especially in things like Skyrim. And no, I'm not talking about nice Core 2 Duos, I'm talking about the bottom of the barrel cheap ones. But then in other tasks, it performs worse than a Pentium 4. So it's really hard to place where this processor lies. Really, the benchmarks didn't make any sense. Something that struggles to run Fable shouldn't be able to launch the load screen of Fallout 4 smoothly, and it definitely shouldn't even be beginning to attempt to run BeamNG. But here we are. It couldn't just be normal. Mostly our issue didn't lie with the performance. It was load times, as they were rough. On average, most games could take anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes to launch, with the process looking like it had frozen, but when you go into Task Manager you can see it is actually still running. So it was just not great for actually trying to benchmark. It took hours, genuinely hours, with newer games nearing in on the 1 hour mark, purely because they have that much data to shift around in. It didn't pipeline stall like a Pentium 4, but it sure took its time like one. Spending this little on a processor though, and you sort of have to be impressed that it even manages to launch the games. I did suffer through a little bit more of the 1P processor experience, as I was quite enjoying using Windows 7 again, but the more I used it, the more I realised that so much of the experience wasn't hampered by the processor. Well, it was a little bit, but take GTA 5 for example. The game launched on Windows 7. It runs on Windows 7. Even the launcher, if you bodge around it the right way, installs and runs on Windows 7. But Rockstar keep making arbitrary changes to prevent you from launching the game. And I know full well that I have a backup of the original files somewhere, and I will probably revisit this CPU to make GTA 5 work on it. But that's where the issue was. So many games and software that used to run on Windows 7, well, now they all have random launchers, and most of these random bits they bolted on prevent them from actually running on the operating system, which was more annoying than using a 1P processor, because that cost me nothing, but I spent a good chunk on these games and I used to run them absolutely fine, and I can understand updating your launcher and all these bits and pieces, but if I can make it run, and you are putting arbitrary bits of code in there to stop me running it on Windows 7, then that is quite anti-consumer, because what if someone out there, I don't know if there is anyone out there, is using the Celeron 450, and maybe they've bought it for 1P as well. You are preventing them from running software that they own, purely because you've decided, nope, Windows 7, that's too old. Well, you launched your software on Windows 7, you launched your game on Windows 7, and I'm going off on a tangent again here. But why am I prevented from running the software that I bought? You know, I know that's not exactly how it works in terms of the digital agreement, but we used to test these things absolutely fine, and now it's become a real pain to launch them. So I will be revisiting this to try and make it run GTA 5 at some point, because I have those original files. I've got a digital backup of the original files, and I will be running them. But, yeah, just a bit of an annoyance there. There really is very little to say. I mean, we could talk about thermals, of which even with an overclock running at anywhere between 3.75 and 3.78 volts, we barely cracked 60 degrees. So this thing doesn't get hot, and that's for sure. It's such a strange chip, because the benchmarks show it performing strangely well, and, you know, the overclocking offer a relatively linear performance increase. But how this translates to the real world is such an odd one, and that's about all I can really say. It can also just about handle modern day tasks, but they will be slow. I always go through and set up these systems on whichever part we're testing, you know, getting the drivers and bits and pieces like that, and it was a chore and a challenge, mostly because the web browser could lock up if it took too long to load, but that's more of an issue with the modern web. After running some add-ons to speed things up, it was a little bit smoother, and, you know, you could probably just about get by on a 1P processor. We were even able to load YouTube. Only 480p was playable, even with H.264ify, and any higher than this, you would lose so many frames you might as well have been watching a PowerPoint. But slowly but surely, this little piece of silicon did manage to run most things you chucked at it. It could just be devastatingly slow. So there we have it, Intel Celeron 450, the new budget king. Well, not really, but as of 2024 it is the cheapest processor that you can go out and buy. And should you? Well, probably not. I mean, even just for the filming of this video, when it was going on, I found and bought an i7 for 75p, you can pick up a second generation i5 for 10p, and, you know, you can pick up a 4th gen i3 for 10p as well from CEX. There is very little reason to get these. But, if you're on LGA 775, even a Core 2 Duo E8400, one of the best dual cores on the platform, is only 10p as well. So it sort of puts into perspective why they want to get rid of these. Still, I know a few people sussed out from the community post what I'd actually bought. Someone emailed in saying they'd bought 5 of these just to overclock them, so, you know, I hope you enjoy spending 5p and overclocking all 5 of your Celerons. It was quite fun doing it myself personally, so I hope that the guy that emailed in and bought 5 of them, I hope you're having a great time with them. I'm keeping it on hand for some future projects, but that's all I'm going to say for now. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed seeing the 1P processor against the world, and good night.